Every leader has a storm that is coming around the corner. The only question is when. Find out what you can do and more from the author of that quote, Dr. DanielHallak, here on the Genetics of Leadership.
Welcome to the Genetics of Leadership, a monthly roundtable about culture and organizational transformation. We are Douglas and Lisa Marie Hatcher, co-founders of Communicate for Impact, and we help organizations align their leadership, strategy, and culture through better storytelling. And of course, joining us today is our co-host, Dan Edds. Dan helps organizations build high-impact cultures that deliver greater employee engagement and create new customer value. And today we are delighted to welcome Dr. DanielHallak, Chief Commercial Officer at Wild Leaders, Inc. Before Wild, Daniel spent more than a decade developing whole leaders in business, academic, and non-for-profit organizations. He has also served both as a management consultant and in a leadership development role at Slalom Consulting. He earned his Ph.D. and master's degrees in industrial organizational psychology from Seattle Pacific University. Welcome, Daniel. We're thrilled to have you join us today. And audience, please feel free to ask questions in the comments section, and we'll try to get to as many of those today as we can.
Daniel, great to have you. Look, I kicked off this episode with your quote, "Every leader has a storm that's coming around the corner. The only question is when." I would love to know the context and the story around that quote. It is so powerful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Douglas. One of the things that has fascinated me over the years is when we talk about leaders and supporting them, we always hear this phrase, leadership can be lonely. And it's almost thrown around so tritely that we don't unpack it. But the reality is, when we're talking about leaders, we're talking about people. And every leader I've worked with is either in the middle of some sort of storm or crisis. They're either in one, they've recently come out of one, or they're going to be going into one. Either they see it on the horizon, or it's going to show up in their inbox or their office over the next week or few months by surprise. And part of the challenge is, how do we support leaders? We know that it's so critical for leaders to be healthy and whole, and yet we sometimes unintentionally set up leaders for failure when those storms come by failing to surround them with the type of support they need to be most effective, both for their sake, but also for the sake of the people who they are serving. So that's a bit of what's behind that quote. And I'd be happy to go a little bit further if you'd want.
Well, was it part of a speech, or it's on your website, but it really struck me.
Yeah. So Douglas, I'll confess, I'm in the middle of writing a book, meaning I have written the book, but I'm now in the process of editing it, which is the actual work.
Yes.
And so I've set out to write a book on how do we help leaders get that type of support that they need. And I think today there's so many paradoxes that make the role of leader isolating that when those storms come, unfortunately, not every leader weathers them, and we see burnout or derailment happen often.
When is your book due out, just so our viewers have an idea of what to look for?
I'm hoping to ask. He's still editing.
I'm hoping to finish the editing in the next couple months and then continue to work with publishing to get it going. So hopefully in the next year or so, we can start to see something out there. So,
well, we'd love to have you back on and talk about the book and promote it.
Love to.
Okay.
That sounds great. So I think I already have an audience question here. Hold on a second. Oh, here we go. Question is, what does WILD stand for, and what does it mean to be a wild leader?
I love that. It's one of my favorite questions. WILD stands for Whole and Intentional Leader Development. And there's a couple meanings to that. One, every one of our stories is a wild story. I haven't had the chance to sit with you, Lisa, or Douglas for a long coffee. I've had lunch with Dan, and I just know from his story in every one of our stories, if we get under the surface, there's a wild story to how we lead and what brought us to where we are now. But the double meaning is that WILD stands for whole and intentional leader development. And that encompasses a lot of our philosophy at WILD about how we develop a person as a leader. Certainly all of us have a whole story. There are personal and professional opportunities and challenges. There are strengths and blind spot. Every leader has a story full of beauty and brokenness, and so that's the whole part. The intentional part is, as a psychologist, there's a word that I love called agency. What does it mean for a leader to have agency and be able to make directives and decisions and think and plan and take forethought? And also, we need a scaffold for our development. And so most of us don't do things without some sort of system and way of doing it. And so that's some of that intentional piece. And when we talk about leaders, we're talking about people at the end of the day. And I know we'll talk more about what is the intersection between people and systems. And then development is a funny word. Development means change. And so I love it when somebody asks a leader to be part of a leader development program. What they're kind of saying is, like, if Dan invites me to be part of a leader development program, what he's really saying is, Daniel, would you be willing to change? And change can be difficult. I had a leader tell me once, she said, I've been through every leadership program out there. And so I asked her, I said, well, what's the common denominator that separates the best programs from the ones that are not as effective? And she said, the most effective leader development programs are always a bit disruptive personally. They're going to challenge you and call you out to some place you need to change. And I could not agree with her more. So as we think about the wild story each of us has, there's a bit of whole and intentional leader development that all of us have in our own story that we're unpacking and continuing to unpack with others in community around us. So that's a bit of what WILD stands for. What it means to be a wild leader is willing to consider the possibility that they might need to change for the sake of other people.
You know, from a storytelling standpoint, Daniel, I mean, the essence of a story is change. If you don't have something transforming or something happening, you don't have a story. So selfishly, from where we sit, we love to hear the fact that you're incorporating change from the get-go, that's what you're signing up for.
Yeah, absolutely. If we're not willing to change, we probably need to check our pulse.
Yeah. So, Daniel, it sounds like when you do your coaching and your training, you're talking about developing the whole person in your coaching. How do large-scale organizations incorporate this perspective and these kind of values into their culture?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways. I'll throw out a couple, and I know that you've put an article in the chat that we can reference as well. A couple of things we like to think of. One of them is this idea of focusing on the one with an eye to the many. And there's a paradox here. I'd say probably everything we think about from a wild perspective has some sort of paradox. And so this idea of how do you focus on an individual and yet at the same time attend to the many? And one of the challenges we see with leaders is that leaders are required to focus on everyone and everyone at the same time. And so you often hear people talk about, well, build your leader development strategy off of the business strategy. And I agree with that. And there's all sorts of things one can do. But one of the tensions is, how do you do something that's going to work for everybody? So building to averages, but also creating space for an individual. I'll give you one example. So we have a suite of assessments in a leader development system that we use. And one of the challenges with assessments is that anytime you have a leader development assessment, people want to see other people's responses. So Dan is a senior mid-level leader in my organization who are thinking of making an executive, as an example. I want to give Dan a battery of assessments and then look at the data to sit with you, Lisa, and you, Douglas, and say, do we think that Dan is ready for leadership? Can he take that position? Does he have what it takes? And part of the challenge is, if Dan knows that Lisa, Douglas, and Daniel are looking over his shoulder as business leaders and psychologists, do you think that Dan's responses are going to change? 100%. And so part of the challenge is how do we take the data aggregate from a system like that for planning and talent purposes? You have to do that. But at the same time, one of the decisions we made is that Dan's feedback reports, Dan's individual level data is Dan's data. And so we tell leaders, nobody is looking over your shoulder. Because I want Dan to have the moment, back to that whole leader development, that he can think about his own change and his own progress and imperfections without feeling like he needs to jockey or manipulate his answers to try to get a high potential list that affords some special opportunities and networking and benefits. And so the challenge is I want to create a unique individual, to use a buzzword today, psychologically safe space for Dan, at the same time being able to use the data across multiple individuals to be able to make talent planning decisions. So those are some of the tensions I think we look at when we focus on the one with an eye to the many. It's planning for the organization and honoring the individual context at the same time.
Daniel, you had referenced an article. If you could let me know which link that is, I can put that up for everyone.
Yeah, there's two that we wrote to address this, our team. One is 10 strategies for building a leader development culture in your organization, and the other one is 10 scientific truths for whole and intentional leader development. One of the things we get passionate about at Wild is that there are literally decades of research that can help inform us to make smarter decisions for questions like this that we often don't go to. And so we end up doing the same thing again and again and trying to recreate the wheel.
Daniel, one of the things we're hearing more and more about is mental health, feelings of personal isolation. Last month we had David Ulrich on our show, who spoke and speaks a lot about workers and feelings of isolation, disengagement from their teams, from their organization. First, two-part question. First, is mental health and feelings of personal isolation, is that something that leaders should be taking responsibility for? And if so, how do they engage all of their leaders and managers in developing this kind of a culture of personal caring and trust?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dan. If I could, let me tease out the challenge as it looks for leaders, and then I will cascade into employees and people what the leaders can do. And I'll read a quick quote from that writing I was telling you, because sometimes I find that I look back on what I've written and it's more articulated in person. So let me read this paragraph. I think it sets up the tension for what leaders face at an isolation level, and then you can see how this impacts individuals. We unintentionally set leaders up for failure. We expect our leaders to be superhumans who will solve all of our needs. We demand that they be hyper-connected and always available to us, yet we expect them to model work-life balance and effective time management. We expect leaders to be authentic and transparent, candidly sharing their struggles and fears, but at the same time staying positive, inspiring, and composed in the middle of storms where the outcome for them personally is uncertain. We want leaders to include people in situations while simultaneously being strong and decisive, casting and keeping a compelling vision without wavering back and forth. We want leaders to have strong convictions, but at the same time, we want them to be humble, willing to request and receive critical feedback. The act of leading is full of tensions. And so I read that because I think that's the challenge that leaders face. And so when I think about who's responsible, we see that those dynamics and paradoxes that a leader faces as a person, of course they're going to feel isolated because they're being asked to do, either explicitly or implicitly, contradictory things. And so I think for the leader, if they're thinking about their people, they need to look no further than their own self to see and think about how are they impacted by isolation. And then from that standpoint, as they start to wrestle through their own brokenness in the midst of their attempts to lead, the question then becomes, so what do I need for myself? And then consequently, how would I do that for my people? Because their people are experiencing some of the same tensions and paradoxes, albeit in different ways. And so what I find is that the simple answer today, the partial answer, the non-whole answer is Well, just do check-ins. Make sure you text your employees, have a regular happy hour on Zoom. And by the way, I would not say all those things are bad. They're good, but they're probably incomplete. And so the responsibility is probably both. There's a responsibility they have, and there's also a responsibility that people have to say, hey, I'm struggling here, right? So there's two-way street. We can easily blame leaders, and I think they're holding a lot as well. But I think going beyond a check-in. So one of the things we encourage leaders to do, we give them what we call a PIP, and not the performance improvement plan, a people investment plan, the antithesis, where we actually walk them through how do we document a plan for investing in other people. And I will work with a leader to say, let's develop your strategic network. Some people call it your board of advisors. I think of your strategic network as people who are stretching you, maybe giving you feedback and new perspectives, people who are supporting you, giving you mentoring or emotional support, and people who are helping you in strategic ways, either advocates in and outside of the business, or maybe the 3 people you'd call tomorrow if you were looking for a job. And as we help people map out their own network, and there could be multiple people filling those buckets inside the organization, outside the organization, as they can start to do that for themselves and they see the power of having that strategic support. The question then is, how can you help the people on your team do that as well? So for example, I've got a team member, Megan, who runs our marketing, and she's awesome at marketing. I know enough about marketing to be dangerous. And so if I'm going to help foster her or help her be connected or effective in her work, I can only take it so far. And so part of what I want to do is help Megan be surrounded and connected to other people who can pick up the gaps where my capabilities, my purview, my understanding and perspective leave off. And so I think it starts with the leader and then thinking through, how can I support the people around me? I think the pandemic over the last couple of years, all it did was highlight the fact that we might not be as good as this as we realize anyways. And it doesn't matter where somebody's virtual or face-to-face, as if we were doing a great job of doing it in person. We just took away some of the artifacts that maybe we relied on that made us feel like we were doing a good job of supporting people or encouraging them. But the reality is many of us had the perception of connectedness, but in actuality, we weren't.
Daniel, I know, or at least I think I know, that we've got a number of people online with us today from the healthcare industry. Chief nursing officers, clinic managers, et cetera. Every one of whom have been fighting on the front lines of a pandemic. How would let's just say, speak to the chief nursing officer who may have 1,000 nurses under his or her area of responsibility and 150 nursing managers, et cetera. How would you talk to them about implementing some kind of a PIP?
The people investment plan or the improvement plan?
Investment plan.
I
love that. I love that concept of the people investment plan as opposed to the improvement plan.
Yeah, one of the things we find is for that particular leader would be a cascading approach, starting with themselves and doing an investment plan for their direct reports, and having an activity where their direct reports are doing it for each other and for them. And this is a bit countercultural. This is where that whole perspective comes in. So often we think about investing down or managing up. One of my litmus tests for when a leader has reached a level of ineffectiveness is if people need to manage up to you. And so often we only think about, well, how do I manage the performance of my direct reports? We don't think about, well, how can I invest in my direct reports, which is different than their development plan. They should have their own development plan. But this is my strategic thinking on how can I invest in you and what do you need? And then I take it to you and I say, hey, Dan, as I'm thinking of investing in you as one of the people on my short list, these are some of my reflections. Could you give me some feedback on where am I slipping? Where am I shining? Where am I spot on? Where am I missing the mark? And by the way, I would love to invite you to do this for me, because we need to invest up and invest laterally, not just invest down. And so when done in that 360 approach, now we can have some conversations on how we're supporting each other and helping ensure success across different boundaries. And now let's invite our direct reports to consider doing it for their direct reports and cascading it down. But I think that's one of the fundamental pieces is a lot of times leaders, and I would, before even suggesting that, I would be looking to see is that leader willing to be part of the problem and part of the solution. Because the leader who just wants to have all of their direct reports or all the mid-level managers create investment plans for everybody else is missing the critical fact that leadership buy-in is completely different than leadership participation.
Quick question, Daniel, sort of a follow-up to that. On a tactical basis, how do you tie this perspective to people's job descriptions, and what incentives do people need to have to actually do this when they've got so many other things they've got to do?
Yeah. Oh, so one of my favorite, I didn't reference it in here, but one of my, I will put it out there. It's an easy Google search. One of my favorite articles, we have an executive fellows program where we bring leaders for this deep program and we give them an introduction to the few decades of psychological science. One of my favorite articles to walk with and that always spurs conversation. It was written in 1975 by Steve Kerr, not the basketball coach today. And his title, it was brilliant. He titled it "On the Folly of Rewarding A While Hoping for B." And I love that article because you could just read the title and you get the point of the article. And he walks through example after example where we hope for one thing, but we actually reward something else. So a fun, silly example at the beginning of COVID, when COVID hit, was that as everybody, I started doing a lot of work at home. I used to be out and about on the road. And so suddenly I'm in my office all the time. And maybe my wife would go out to get groceries because the lines were really long and she's going to plan a 3-hour block just to get toilet paper. So my kids would be home. And they quickly realized if I go to dad's door and I hold up an iPad and I knock on the door, I hold up the iPad and they point to it, I'm going to do this. Yes, like I'm on a call. Do it. Take the iPad. Take all the snacks. Take the car. Take all my money. Take anything you want. Just go inside my car. Right? And so, because what do I want? I don't want them to interrupt me. So it hit me. We read through this article with the group, and it hit me. I thought, I'm hoping they'll stay quiet and not interrupt me. But I've actually rewarded them for interrupting me because when they come to the door, I'm going to give them what they want. So I instituted a new rule. I said, here's the deal. If you interrupt daddy on a phone call or a Zoom call on the computer, the answer is no. I do not care what it is. The answer will be no. It might be something I'd say yes to, but the answer is no because he interrupted me. And so that was like structurally realigning. So I think when we look at the multiple competing priorities that managers and leaders have, here's the challenge. We often expect somebody to do one thing, but reward them for something else. We hope for collaboration, but we reward silos.
Yeah.
The favorite example in the article, we've all experienced this, is the person who we hope that people will be fiscally responsible in, I don't know, a government organization, but we actually take away their budget at the end of the year if they don't spend it all.
Yes.
Like it's classic. So anyhow, like I think it's difficult to look at, but what are some of the underlying things that might be causing behaviors we don't want, and then getting those in line with our spouse values from a structural standpoint is one of the things I often look for.
Excellent. Pivoting a little bit here, numerous studies suggest, Daniel, that organizational leadership is getting worse, not better. Other studies suggest that only a third of first-time managers receive any training or coaching in leadership. In your view, how can organizations create a culture that puts an emphasis on developing emerging leaders?
It's a great question. I'm not sure if it's getting worse or just more complicated. The conventional wisdom would say, do a needs analysis, figure out what they need, build some programming around that, get executive buy-in, which again, I think, as I mentioned before, executive buy-in is different than participation. I found a couple things. It has to start with a business need, but that also has to be paired with a deep desire. I sat with the president of an organization once who was committed to investing in people, and I asked him, I said, so why do you care about investing in people? And I asked him a handful of questions around that same line of inquiry. And he finally blurted out, he said, it's just the right thing to do. I just believe in it. And I thought, I love that that's the case. I want leaders like that. But I think that's partial, because what I found is that same leader, when push comes to shove and there's a cut in the budget or another strategic need, might actually default to, well, we'll put this on the back burner for now. And so I think heart's desire is important. And I think today we're seeing more and more people who are aware of the importance for themselves and others. One leader I met with said, I am the product of leadership development efforts, and so I want to give that to my people. So I think that, combined with the strategic need, if somebody does not have a strategic need for leader development, it is always going to be relegated to training, and training is not impactful in the way we typically do it. And so that longer term view of a business need has to go beyond ROI. When a leader is asking about, well, what's the ROI on this investment effort? That's a signal to me that they're looking for a short-term gain. When development of a person is not a short-term proposition. It doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be 20 years, although you might be thinking that term, but it's at least 2 to 5 years out. And so the person is looking for just a quick hit because people are asking for it, Glassdoor reviews are down or whatever, is probably not the person who's going to make a sustainable long-term investment. But if they've got the heart, if they've got a clear business need, now we've got some fertile ground, I think, to start from putting developmental programs or leveraging the experiences that a challenging organization builds in process.
Very helpful. Interesting. Dan, I think you've got a question.
Yeah, I'd actually like to come back, Daniel, to your earlier comment about reward and recognition and the misalignment of these. So, again, talk to the CEO, the CFO, the COO that we might have on with us this morning, the healthcare manager, clinic manager. And I totally agree on, and I've seen way too many times, this misalignment of reward and recognition with strategy and with culture. So let's say an organization says, we really want to build our culture around people. We want a people-centric culture. What does a recognition reward program look like? Especially when they've got competing demands for, meeting this quarter's revenue targets.
Yeah, I think one thing is clarity about what do we actually want to reward in the first place. And so, for example, corporate perks are nice, but I don't think they actually get to true rewards. And what are the attitude? I mean, all psychology is the ABCs is affect, behavior, and cognition. So what are the affects, the feelings that we want people to have? What are the behaviors we want people to reward? And what are the cognitions or thoughts that we want to have that interplay with those? Like, what are the things we actually want to define this culture? And I think a people-centered culture, I used to do career counseling, and I cannot tell you, every single person would say that they want to do something. How many people would come in and say, I want to do something that helps people? It's like, well, actually, every job helps people in some way or hurts them, is connected to people. And so I would push that leader to say, can you define a people-centric culture for you? And I think, Dan, this is one of the things that you do so well with your work on a leadership system, is helping them define what does that mean for them. It might look completely different in a rural healthcare setting than at a hospital, than a busy, bustling clinic in a metropolitan center.
Yep.
And what do we actually want this culture to be? And then let's back into the things that we're hoping to reward it and accentuate. And if revenue is a big deal, well, let's figure out what things are going to build the culture and reward revenue at the same time. Like, there's no reason that revenue should be separated. Let's connect them together. Like, that's a meaningful thing. and we can help give people line of sight from what their work does to actually driving revenue at the same time.
Yeah, Daniel, I love that. I'm not sure if you've been listening to me or I've been listening to you, but I love that analogy of the rural healthcare system versus the big urban teaching hospital. The cultures, justifiably so, ought to be radically different, and we should be looking at a different kind of reward and recognition system. But talk to us a bit about the connection between the business strategy, the people investment strategy, and the reward and recognition system.
Yeah, I mean, it has to start with the business strategy for sure. And
Okay.
so
So you're not discounting the business strategy as a fundamental component to that.
Absolutely. I think, and I'm assuming there is a business strategy.
Yeah, assuming, yes.
Because in some places there isn't a business strategy. And I think one of the places, if I could give it a little bit of a gripe, the talent leader in that system, if they're not tying to or contributing to the business strategy, they're just making noise.
Yep.
Yep.
And oftentimes I find that my good friends in those spaces, they show up as a cost center.
Yes.
And they don't show up as a strategic driver or as an order taker that says, well, tell me what the business strategy is, and then I'm gonna cascade that into my system. And I'd say, actually, if you don't know your business, like quite literally, how does your organization make money and serve people, then we can't even talk about a people strategy or a reward system, because now here's what's going to happen. We're going to do a best practice scan. Look at what other organizations do. I don't really care. Oftentimes we do a needs analysis. Like, this is my favorite thing. And by the way, I'm not going to knock on a needs analysis, but here's what happens. We ask leaders, how would you like to be rewarded? What would you like to learn? What programs should we put in place? And those leaders are busy doing their work, so they don't actually know. It's kind of like asking my kids, what would you like for dinner? And they're never going to say broccoli.
And they probably won't agree. Daniel, the point about cost center and being an order taker, that applies not only to talent in HR, but to comms, marketing. All these other functions suffer from the same kind of problem you're just describing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think it's getting beyond that. Like, let's actually frame the business strategy. Let's assume that the organization is flourishing, that people are going to be flourishing in it as well. If it's flourishing sustainably. And so let's look at that business strategy and then cascade that into how do we harmonize and combine these and let them go both ways. And so I think that's often noted as, oh, of course you have to start with the business strategy, but we just move beyond it quickly. And so we don't actually even get to creating rewards that are going to reinforce what we're hoping to do.
Couldn't agree more.
I love that.
Fantastic. Daniel, thank you. It's been a great show today. It's been really wild, and we loved having you. And I just posted your contact information on the screen for everyone to check out. You can also find a replay of this episode on our website at communicateforimpact.com or on Dan's website at DanielEdds.com. This has been fantastic. This has been so much fun. And I hope everyone will join us for our next Genetics of Leadership episode on May 20th at noon Eastern Time. We're going to have Dr. Beverly Kay. Bev is a renowned author, speaker, and thought leader on employee development, employee engagement, and employee retention. Until then, thanks again, Daniel, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Stay safe until we see each other again.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, y'all.